Life is full of some very big questions. And in this series of presentations, we're going to look at some of these big questions. Does life have a meaning and purpose? How do we know what's right and wrong? What happens after death? In fact, does God exist? Is our future all kind of predetermined, or is it all open to our free will and choice? In fact, how did life arise? Or looking at the universe, how did the universe come into being? What is truth? And how and when will everything end? Or will it end? And that big problem that the world suffers from today, where there is so much suffering. And in the end, how can we get answers to these kind of big questions? These are big questions. And if we listen today, we'll hear all kinds of viewpoints and opinions expressed. Some say there's one creator God, while others say that God is just a human invention created in our minds. Some say that there's one creator God, others say that there are multiple gods. Some say there are universal moral standards, right and wrong. Others deny that. Some point to death being the end of human existence, that's it, while others see death as a gateway to further life. Some see life being controlled entirely by the laws of cause and effect, while others see life in a sense of being random, and things happen largely by chance. Some see humans being totally free to choose, while others see human destiny in some way predetermined. Some see suffering, sadly just cruel chance, circumstances of where we've born and when. While for others, suffering has some kind of a meaning. Many opinions, many thoughts. How do we know in the road of life? Does it have any meaning, life itself? Do we know we're on the right way? How do we cope when it's hard going and things are stacked against us? And is there indeed any sort of destination at all? What's life all about? But fundamentally, how do we get answers to my questions, your questions, the questions we all have from time to time? And in this series, I'm going to look at the logic of Christianity. Looking coldly, logically, at what Christianity is all about. Does it give any pointers to answers to these questions? In the process, we'll look at all sorts of alternatives, both from religious and secular backgrounds. What is the logic of Christianity? Does it hold any answer to these kind of big questions? And we're going to look at that strictly in terms of evidence, not opinion, not proof. There are many things where it is not possible to prove things. I would argue that in fact that is true for almost all of life. Proof is an impossibility. But evidence, strong evidence, that's open to us. We've got to disentangle what are the facts from what are the kind of myths that have built up in our cultures, in our communities, families and religious systems, and get at the evidence. But we have to ask questions. What do we mean by evidence? What kind of evidence? What are the sources of evidence, and how can we know? So much of what we believe and accept comes from our upbringing, our home and our family. But much comes from the society into which we happen to have been born, or the cultural norms, and the habits of that society. But there are authority figures. Very often they are religious authority figures. And we are hesitant to question them. I'm suggesting we should. We should look for the evidence behind their claims. There's much that's been written down in the history of mankind where great men and women have gained insights based on evidence. And of course the world, the sciences, has offered us a tool and a mechanism to explore how this world works, indeed how the universe works. We've got evidence from history, some of it written down, some of it oral history, some seen in terms of buildings and artifacts. Lots of historical evidence from archaeology. And of course there are our own life experiences and the life experiences of our parents and grandparents, relatives and friends. Can we rely on such experiences to give us insights? But too often we decide what's true by our own personal preferences. It suits us, it fits our way of thinking, it makes life easy for us, or it may make sense of life for us as well. How do we bring all these and perhaps other sources of evidence together to look at answers to some of these questions? If you think about religious knowledge, and as soon as you ask these kind of questions, you're into the religious area of life. It dabbles into philosophy as well. But religion is the area which has addressed these questions most often. The main sources of religious knowledge come to us today through our school education. We've picked things up from books and from courses. But it also comes to us through media. Things are printed, visual or electronic today. Of course there are religious systems and religions where things are taught, and very often they come to us through the media or through school education. But in the West today, where most do not get involved in any active way in Christian activities, our main sources of evidence come from school and media. But there are sources of information that come through churches, mosques and temples. But in the West today, that's where we've ended up. Now there are tremendous exceptions to that. There are small minority groups throughout the West which have a vibrant and active Christian faith. There are small groups that are active and vibrant within the mosques and the Islamic faith traditions. And it's probably true in all religions. But overall, in our society today, and you can see it in our media, that's where we've got to. But that doesn't really answer the questions. And we've got to recognise the inadequacy of where we're at the moment. Let's just look at how religion is seen today in the West. For most, not all, but most, there's quite a high level of ignorance. The image of religion is something negative, restrictive, a set of rules that you've got to wear, places you can't go to that you can go to, foods that you can eat or can't eat, and so on. All negative and restrictive. Some argue that science has undermined religion totally. In fact, the evidence for that is very small. For most in society today, and you'll see it in our media, religions in general are regarded as harmless delusions. But with the advent of brutality and the suicide bombing from the radical Islamist tradition, it's sometimes very harmful. But our political leaders and our media don't know quite how to handle this and what to make of it. And they often mislead us. Historically, religions have done that. But we've got to put that into perspective. Political systems have done it far worse than religions have ever done it. Far, far worse. And the evidence is very clear. For many in our society today, religions, particularly the kind of Christianity that goes around in our media, doesn't really address the problems. While some see religious activities resisting social progress, it's living in the past and trying to impose past norms of society today. There are many who admire the teaching of Jesus, but they see him as no more than a good person. Or, in the case of Muslims, as a prophet. Doesn't go beyond that, though. And the idea of God being relevant in everyday life and addressing the real issues of life, well, just escapes us. And for most, some of the ideas that float around like creationism, for which there's no evidence, miracles, the divinity of Jesus and afterlife, for which there is considerable evidence, they're mocked. They couldn't have happened. They're not real. But life goes on. There are much more important things. We don't have to bother with these kind of questions because they don't really take us forward. Now that's the kind of general public media cultural image of religion in general in the West. The illogicality of proof. I put that up as the logic of Christianity as an opposite. There are those who say that, and their voices are very strident today. There are those who say that, and these statements are made as if they're absolutely black and white and proved. Proof is illogical. But if you take that line, there's no God, humans are the highest form of life, then the whole logic of the survival of the fittest becomes the dominant drive. But if you work that through, and it's worth pondering that through, the consequences might be pretty horrifying. Well, those who are strongest and fittest survive, and those who are weaker do not. If you go to the other extreme, if we think we're in possession of all knowledge about God, and we really know, and that's a strong view that comes from particularly Islam and some branches of Christianity, then the logic of that is, if we know how God works, if we know enough, it's all predictable. So these raise big questions in our mind. And what I'm going to suggest is that the world around, the real world around, our understanding of the world around, is based on a kind of balance of probability. Things have got to be weighed as alternatives. And that requires we explore the evidence. And I'm going to invite you in this series not to look for proof, not to look for things that are black and white, but to look for understandings and insights based on a careful, rigorous exploration of the evidence. And it comes to a balance of probability, not certainty. Now, in fact, that fits the way the world has been made, where the laws of probability underpin so much of the physical world around us. But let's leave that on the side for the moment. But the key word is that far too much religion is based on assertion. You could say the same for political systems as well as religious systems. Assertion, opinion, dogmatism, shouting at people. Let's quietly come and look at the evidence and look at the balance of probability in seeking to answer the question. So we're back to the logic of Christianity. As you come with me in this series, you're going to have to use your minds, your intellects. But I'm inviting you to keep open attitudes. We're going to have to engage with the ideas. It's going to be hard work. Hold on to your seat, put your brain in gear, and let's look at this seriously. But let's be willing to engage with the ideas, even when the ideas make us feel uncomfortable. Embrace that excitement. Look at it and see where it leads you to a balance of probabilities. One of the sad things about Christian communities, churches, religious systems in general, is the failure of effective communication. There's not a clear message coming out about what is the logic of Christianity. There are many, many excellent books, but these issues are not really being addressed clearly within the capacity of the listener, the ordinary folk like you and me. So we're not really engaging our intellects with the issues. But at the same time, there's responsibilities on us all. We've got to engage with ideas, evidence, even when it's uncomfortable. And not just dismiss it, undermine it, and ignore it. That has happened far too often in religious circles. Now I give you a challenge. If you're up to the challenge, come with me and let's see where it leads in this series of presentations. We're like detectives looking for clues. And I'm going to suggest at the starting point 2 sources of evidence. This may surprise you. I didn't invent this. There are many great writers and philosophers and thinkers who've drawn our attention to this over many centuries. 2 sources of evidence. One is the evidence of the world, or the universe, strictly speaking, around us. And the other evidence is ourselves. We're going to start by looking at the world, the universe, and looking at ourselves. And let's see where that takes us. There are some universal laws that seem to apply. In our school days we come across physics and chemistry. And these 2 sciences have built up to an enormous level. And they've given us insights into how the physical world works, always works. We've also done some study at school perhaps in the biological world. And again, there are principles by which the biological world works. Always works. But there's a third one. Looking at ourselves within the biological world, within the physical world, and there are laws of human nature, but they're not quite the same. Let's look at that. If you take the top 2, these are summaries. Summaries of the consistent ways by which the world, and indeed the wider universe, always operate. It just seems to always work this way. You can predict, and it happens. We have to take in the laws of probability, particularly in the biological world, but also in the quantum world. But there are consistent principles by which the universe works. It's not quite the same with the laws of human nature, because this describes how we humans think we should live to bring benefits for ourselves and wider society. Now, those who have studied this have observed that across cultures and across time, there's a lot of common ground in how we think we should live. It's by no means perfect, but there are things that are regarded as wrong and things that are regarded as right and good. And while it is in no way perfect or totally consistent, there's a lot of common ground across religions, across time, across cultures, across continents. How did that arise? You see, we're not just like the other animals following instincts. Yes, we have instincts, and they're there for good reasons. But we go beyond that. There's a kind of moral dimension, an ethical dimension, a right-wrong dimension within humanity. And there is at least some common ground, mediates to us through conscience, some common ground about how we think we should live, what's acceptable. There's some interesting ideas that just come by looking at the world around and ourselves. But I pointed out that there are fundamental differences, or basically one fundamental difference between the two, because the laws of nature, physical and biological, that describes how the world, the universe, actually works. It has always done it. But this one has the should. Because as we look out in ourselves and our cult societies, we don't always do it. But the law codes of various nations and cultures, religious systems, much in common. They describe what we should be doing, recognizing that very often we don't, and it often builds in the punishments that should come when people don't. But that raises a very fundamental question. How is it that human beings have a moral and ethical awareness? We all have it from early infancy, childhood. Starts to be seen very clearly when you get to about age 2 or so. Those who have looked at this biologically reveal to us that there's no obvious evolutionary advantage. So why is it there? How did it arise? Where did it come from? Fundamental question. Back to our universe. Broadly, in societies and cultures across the world, there are two views. Now, this is oversimplified, and there are various combinations. There are those who regard matter and space just happening to exist, and that the world, matter, material, just happens to behave in the way it does, because it does. There are just simply laws and principles that are derived from the world of physics and chemistry. The other perspective is the religious one, but there are consequences for the materialist view. Because if we take that line, it means that life on this planet came into being by the simple logic, the logic following the principles of the laws of nature, physics and chemistry, and the chance events of the past. And it's evolved on from there. But back to the religious view. This assumes, doesn't prove, assumes that behind the universe is some kind of mind. The mind may be called a principle, a rationale, God, Allah, gods. But somehow, behind this mind, there's a purpose. Now, the logic of that is that the purpose was, maybe the major purpose, or in part, was to generate creatures, you and me. And we also possess minds reflecting the mind behind the universe. Now, you can see the great difference between the two, and probably you can place yourself somewhere in one camp or the other, or in some sort of bit of combination of the two ideas. Raises interesting question. If we look at ourselves, the fact that we possess minds, we don't just run by instinct, minds that are conscious of good and evil, right and wrong, minds that can take decisions based on evidence. Is that evidence that there's some mind that created us? Or did it all arise simply by the chance events of the logic of evolution in a physical world that just happens to exist the way it does? That's a fundamental question. Now let's look at the mind behind the universe. Let's assume that mind exists. What you can say is this: it must have immense complexity and power. Just look at the universe. And the discoveries in the last, let's say 50, 100 years, mainly through the world of physics, has thrown enormous light on this. But simply because we human beings are aware of right and wrong, and we share some kind of awareness of what is right and what is wrong, albeit imperfectly, that suggests that the mind behind the universe operates on fixed moral, ethical principles. Because it couldn't have arisen in human beings because there's no evolutionary advantage. It's a disadvantage in strict evolutionary terms. Another interesting question: does that make sense, or shall we say more sense, of what we observe of ourselves and our world? That's worth pondering as well. And into that comes the logic of Christianity. We've merely introduced the theme in this first presentation. The next part, we're going to look at ourselves in more detail in our world and develop these ideas further.